Hi, it's Andy Silver from Decarbonize here in Granada, Spain at the Alhambra. And believe it or not, in this place of amazing grandeur and beauty, I'm thinking about infrastructure.
The Alhambra was constructed between 1238 and the expulsion of the Moors in 1492 on a hill overlooking the city by the Muslim leaders of the Emirate of Granada. After the expulsion of the Moors, the site became the royal court of Ferdinand and Isabella, and this is where they granted Columbus a royal endorsement for his expedition. In the 17th century, it fell into disrepair and has been undergoing restoration since the 19th century. Walking through the Alhambra made me think about the process that the emirs went through to dedicate resources to building the palace, and comparing it to what we do today. There were no court financial planners doing return on investment or ROI calculations. They were imagining something that would still strike awe in the hearts of those who saw it centuries later. They were building for the ages. There's an old Mediterranean saying that you plant grapes for your children and olives for your grandchildren. But we live in a world where we only grow crops that can be harvested later that year. Decisions are made with a timeline as short as the quarterly report, or maybe as long as an election cycle. Leaders look at ROI calculations and only give the green light to projects that are guaranteed to pay for themselves within a few years. But the infrastructure that we need to build to decarbonize our society will require a long-term mindset. When making ROI calculations, what value do you put on not flooding Tuvalu or Bangladesh? Our response to climate change needs to be driven by a vision of a world without fossil fuels, not a spreadsheet. We used to drive projects based on a vision. For instance, the Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, which was part of the New Deal, brought electrification to rural homes. Now, it's hard to imagine living without electricity, but in 1935, that was normal in rural America. No running water, electric lights, radio, or refrigeration. Cooking and heating were done with wood. Between 1935 and 1955, the percentage of farm homes with electricity went from about 15 to 95. This wouldn't have happened without the government making a long-term commitment that this was critical. It was understood that everyone deserved to have flush toilets. It began with a vision, and it was understood that the benefits would be worth it, even if they couldn't be quantified at the start. I have no question the REI had an amazing ROI, but how could they have quantified all of the improvements in the beginning? In 1935, could they have imagined electric milking machines? Did they know how much milk was lost to spoilage that could be saved with refrigeration? How many trees were saved since electricity could be used for heating and cooking? Nearly 90 years later, we're still benefiting from the grid that the REA built. The Rural Electrification Act was amended as recently as 2014 to support a pilot project to bring broadband internet to rural communities. It is still relevant. I don't think President Kennedy did a cost-benefit analysis on whether or not to go to the moon. When he said,
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone."
He was setting a vision of what we should do, damn the accountants. It's hard to remember just how audacious this goal was when he first stated it, over a year before John Glenn became the first American in space. Countless new technologies needed to be invented to deal with navigation, life support, propulsion, and re-entry, just to name a few. By comparison, decarbonizing our society is easy, as it requires no new technology. There's plenty of evidence that NASA has been a great investment. But in 1961, how could you quantify the value of weather satellites that allow us to predict the course of a hurricane, or the thousands of other advancements that have come out of the space program? But I don't see that kind of vision from our leaders in response to climate change. And without a vision, we're not taking the right steps. In 2022, the National Renewable Energy Lab was budgeted $380 million. By comparison, Los Alamos National Lab got $3.4 billion, primarily for research on nuclear weapons. This is a bit of a simplification since there's lots of other funding for renewable energy and nuclear weapons, but 10 to 1 is probably a good ballpark. We spend 10 times as much money figuring out how to destroy the world as we do to save it. Interestingly, the biggest sustainable energy news of last year, the fusion result from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, came out of a weapons research program, not a renewable energy one. We should set a vision to quickly eliminate fossil fuels and figure out the best way to do that. We know that decarbonizing our grid will have benefits beyond just protecting our climate, improving air quality and health, fewer battles over resources, and other advances that we can't foresee at this time. But just protecting our climate is a sufficient reason to push ahead with all of the tools at our disposal. But this isn't happening, not even close. If we had a vision to eliminate all fossil fuels as soon as possible, obviously we wouldn't be subsidizing them. But according to the International Energy Agency, worldwide fossil fuels receive about $1 trillion in subsidies. In the US alone, the subsidies are estimated to be worth about $20 billion, which is greater than the $15 billion spent on subsidies for renewable energy. And this only includes direct payments and doesn't include the cost of climate pollution. Let's look at our electricity grid for another example. Given the dual challenges to decarbonize our grid, that is, replacing fossil fuel power plants with renewable sources like wind and solar that are not necessarily located near our load centers, our cities, and electrifying as much as possible things like home heating and electric cars, it's obvious we need to build out our grid significantly. According to a 2022 report from Princeton University's REPEAT project, to unlock the full emissions reduction potential of the Inflation Reduction Act, the pace of transmission expansion must more than double the rate over the last decade. There were 8 years between Yuri Gagarin's flight into space and Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon, but it took 16 years between when the Trans-West Express transmission line was proposed to when construction started. It will be another 6 years until power starts flowing from wind farms in Wyoming to Salt Lake City and Las Vegas. The current process of approving and funding transmission lines is so slow and complex that it makes it impossible to build transmission lines fast enough. There is some good news. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provide some much needed funding, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is pursuing some equally needed reforms. This may allow us to build enough transmission. But we're still building transmission lines without a vision. It's not just that we need to build more transmission lines, but we do. We need to build the kind of grid that supports the vision of a world without fossil fuels, rather than looking at local issues or building lines that support a single project. Without a vision, we're building the wrong grid. The first video on this channel was about building the kind of grid we need, a national or macro grid designed to transport renewable energy from the windy and sunny states to every corner of the lower 48. That's not what we're currently building. I could do an entire video on the way things are improving, but it's without the unifying vision that FDR and JFK brought to their challenges. Biden's commitment to reduce carbon emissions by half from 2005 levels in 2030 is great, but I don't see society getting behind this, talking about it, making decisions around this vision. We have so many decades of broken commitments on climate, from Kyoto to Paris, that it just feels like another empty promise, not an organizing vision. From COP28, we got a commitment for, quote, transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, which doesn't have the poetry of Kennedy's speech on going to the moon or the straightforwardness of the REA. This is not a vision that is consistent with the science, that makes it clear we should have started in earnest decades ago. A good vision would be something like, ending the use of fossil fuels by 2040, or no new investments in fossil fuel exploration or infrastructure. We have the technologies, we have the money. What we need is a straightforward vision that we can all rally behind. If you feel inspired by this video, please like and subscribe and share with anyone you feel would be moved by hearing Kennedy's Go to the Moon speech.